right, thank you so much. It is an understatement to say it's an honor to be here with all of you tonight. And I'm going to put my water down. I'm reflecting on this love, liberation, South Side, West Bank, everything in between. And I've got to admit that watching that montage of our journey, I knew it would make me emotional, but I think that's really putting it mildly. And I think it's no coincidence that it was IMAN and Rami that really made that happen, right? It didn't just come about. It was built on the 2 decades of work that's been happening right here on 63rd, right, across the South Side, forging communities, Black communities, Palestinian communities, all people who care about freedom in this city. And, also between what injustices we see in our communities, but also what love looks like in our community as well. So as I was watching that, I was just thinking about, that journey was at least 2 decades in the making, and if not, not more. And I'm just thinking also on that first day that we were there, you saw the sign, somebody welcoming us, somebody who became really dear to us there. And that first day, we literally raced to the Mount of Olives to catch the sunset as it, fell over the old city with the Masjid al-Aqsa in the background. It was really surreal, but we literally had to race to make it because if anyone's ever traveled with Dr. Rami Nashashibi, you're going to be on the go. And so we caught it. We caught the sun going down. That's right. We caught the sunset that night, and in many ways, we've been racing ever since. Racing to something, racing from something, and racing home one by one as we made it here, literally one by one, and only by the grace of God after October 7th. And so those months since have just been devastating in many ways, and they've put that shared experience into a new context for us. We knew it would be big when we were there, but we just had no idea what it would all mean, and I think we're all still making sense of that. And so I was reminded recently, and you all may know Dalia Magahid. I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and she reminded me that when we feel this sense of overwhelm, we're all watching what's unfolding, and it feels so big. It's like, what can I do? And she reminded me that it's not our individual responsibility to bring about justice. For those of us of faith, we know we have to believe that there's a creator who will do that. But it is our responsibility to do what we can, step by step, little by little, and it's our honor to be a part of this movement. The movement, we need the movement. It doesn't need us, right? We need this. And so it's honestly such a privilege to be on stage with you people who are showing us how to do that in your work every day, step by step, really guiding us into how we can all step into this moment right now. So I'm just gonna, with that, just jump right in. Dima, I'm gonna start with you. I'd really love to stay in this connectedness, but also just start with what are we actually seeing, right? We're all watching this unfold in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Around the world, Palestinians who've been begging us to bear witness to what's going on, what we're seeing. We're seeing courage and, again, love. And so could you just put into words what is unfolding on the ground? Yes, in terms of the bombardment, but also just in terms of, these past 7.5 decades and, what we're seeing unfold when it comes to occupation and the violence that we're witnessing, and why it matters so much that we, right here in Chicago, speak up and do something about it.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Yes. It's such an honor to be here with Marc and Reverend Moss, and thank you so much, Iman, and to you, Kaldia, and this is really so amazing to just be in community and to have the chance to mourn together, and also to move together and mobilize. because, as you said, it's really we need this. We need to be in community with each other and to process what is happening. That was a really big question about a long history. But I guess I'll start with, the Palestinian people have been struggling, as we've heard, for over 75 years now, really, to hold on to their land, to hold on to their peoplehood and their culture, and this history of struggle. And it didn't begin with the creation of the State of Israel, right? Before the State of Israel, we were struggling against British colonial occupation. And before that, in various ways. But our national movement really began in the 1920s and 1930s. And when 1947, 1948 came along, we found ourselves a refugee population. The Nakba of 1948, when the State of Israel was created a refugee population of nearly 1 million people that was expelled into the rest of the Arab world, and Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and the West Bank and Gaza. And so we're talking about a population of refugees. Gaza is 80% refugees from 1948, and then again from 1967. And of course, there are many Palestinians who were able to remain in what is now Israel in 1948 territories, but they too are second-class citizens. They do not have the same rights as Jewish citizens, Jewish Israelis. And so over the course of these 7.5 decades, we have struggled. We have resisted at every turn. And I think that is something that I really hold on to, and that I also really connect with other struggles. I mean, Black people have resisted all the way from, from the shores of Africa to today, are struggling against the 400 years of oppression. And that is part of the human spirit. We resist the oppression that is brought upon us. And that makes us agents. We are not victims. We are agents of this history. We are writing this history. And that really resonated with me, that we have a role to play here. And as you said, Reverend, the empire is trying to write the story, and they have to silence us in order to do that. And that's what's happening here. We know our history. We know what happened to us. We know that our land was taken, that that the goal of the Zionist state is to erase us in order to create a Jewish state, right? That is the goal, and that's what we see happening before our eyes in Gaza. They are trying to erase us, and it's part of a very long process. And our role is to resist that erasure, and that's what's happening right now in the streets here, in the art that we create, in the songs that we sing, in the dance. You know, our resistance includes love and laughter and mobilization. I mean, there have been hundreds of thousands of people in the streets saying, no, we will not go. We will not be erased. We will not submit. We will not give up our hope for freedom. Yes, from the river to the sea, right? Because as Palestinians, that is where we come from the area, from the river to the sea. And we have never been granted the right of return. We have never been granted the ability to live in freedom and dignity in all of the land that is ours, that was our ancestors, where our family is buried, where we have a connection to that land. Rifat's, hearing Rifat speak was just so moving, right? That we have the stories that go back centuries that connect us to the land. My ancestors were buried in a cemetery in West Jerusalem that has now been turned into a park, that they raised, that they dug up the bones in the cemetery to create a museum of tolerance. Can you imagine? They are erasing not only our present, but also our past. And so that is our role here. That is why we are here, to resist, to show that, you have to get rid of all of us. And that's why it's so important for us to be here together, to connect, to really struggle together across our oppression and also our love and our community.
Thank you. Yes. So, Marc, we keep talking about connection, right? The connection between our struggles, the connection between our faith, the connection between the way we love each other. This solidarity work is obviously not new to you, so I just want you to make it really, really plain. For those who may still be asking this question, why should Black people care and mobilize around what's happening with all that folks are dealing with? Why should we care? Why should we mobilize around Gaza and Palestine more broadly?
That's a wonderful question. First of all, good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. Shout out to Rami for making this happen. I'm honored to be here with these wonderful, extraordinary people who I consider friends and allies and comrades and co-conspirators, accomplices, as we struggle for freedom. And I think for me, the first place I begin is always Black people should be struggling for Palestinian liberation simply because it's the right thing to do. I begin from the moral place, right? If I had no investment in this, if I had no outcome that would benefit me, if for no other reason, but simply as in this room believers, whatever your faith is, we have a duty to struggle for justice. You come out of a Jewish tradition. It's a tradition that's not marked by the state of Israel, and its statecraft is marked by a commitment to justice and welcoming strangers and mercy. We talk about Christian faith, you're talking about mercy, grace, unmerited grace. In Islam, we're talking about what? Mercy, grace. As we're talking about the 99 names, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. How many of the 99 names are about mercy and grace and forgiveness? And so I begin there, a commitment to justice. It is impossible to hear the story of Palestine. As you said, not just 75 years, one might argue a 100 years war on Palestine. And not hear a settler colonial project, ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid, depopulation, disinherit, all the words. How could we not respond to that? Some people say, well, I prefer to follow my tradition. Well, as a Black person, there's a long tradition of black folk fighting and struggling for Palestinian liberation. Now, it hadn't always been like that. There was a moment, I would argue, if you look at the turn of the 20th century, and I won't bore y'all with the details, but I won't get into the weeds of it, but I mean, sure, Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois and other black nationalists very much aligned with the Zionist movement for liberation. But the question is why? Well, because they saw an oppressed people, and what they imagined was a liberation project against colonizers. What they did not anticipate was that those colonizers, or that those colonized people rather, those oppressed people would jump out of the burning buildings of Europe and land on the backs of Palestinian people. And so, as time moved on and it became more clear, we saw the shift. By the time you get to the 1950s, black folk, the black radical tradition, the black church, all of us are beginning to understand this differently. King in his last days was questioning what was happening there. He didn't want to sign on to the list of ministers and civil rights leaders who were aligned with Israel in the aftermath of the 1967 war. He said Israel had become arrogant. He was appalled at what was happening in East Jerusalem, the very project you were just talking about. Malcolm X, 1964, writes an essay in the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic, where he's identifying it as a colonial project, a neo-colonial project. But there's a tradition of a black radical tradition that recognized this. So if you follow the tradition, do that. But it's not just that. The black radical tradition understood it not just because it's moral, and not just because we did it before, but because there is an analysis that we need to have as oppressed people that recognizes that our oppression is linked. There's no passport for capitalism. Right? White supremacy doesn't stop at a border. You get what I'm saying? There's no Hawiya for apartheid. There's a way that we must recognize that our freedom is inevitably bound up in each other's. Gwendolyn Brooks says, we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. We are each other's harvest. I want y'all to sit with that. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. I cannot get free in a world where there is a hyper-security state that is expanding. And it is expanding because nation states are beginning to model each other. So when we have the deadly exchange programs of law enforcement between the United States and Israel, part of what we are learning is how to treat an oppressed, marginalized, racialized population as an outside threat. We learn how to prioritize security over civil rights, over human rights, over civil liberties, over everything else. When we get scared, we can do whatever we want. That's a post-9/11 logic. It's also an intifada logic. It's going to be a post-October 7th logic. We see it in the West Bank right now. So, and it's exchange, because we're also training Israeli military how to do that too. America didn't need Israel to teach us how to kill black people. America has been killing black people a long time. And vice versa. But when we start to exchange technologies and techniques and tactics, things only get worse. So we're bound up in each other. And then the last thing I'm gonna say is, some of y'all say, well, I'm black nationalist, I'm Pan-African. I care about black people. Did you see that video? Did y'all see that beautiful video? There's a long-standing African presence in historic Palestine. You see Ali Jeddah? He calls himself the Morgan Freeman of Jerusalem. He's part of a generations of folk, as he said, who've been in the old city. But it's not just him. You go to Jericho, go to Ain Diuk, you'll see people who can't even tell you when they got there, but they've been there that long. You got folk from Chicago, the Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. They live in Dimona, but they call themselves the Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. Right? Why? Because Jerusalem is a centerpiece for black identity, black traditions, black churches, if I forget the old Jerusalem. Right? Black Israelites, black African folk, people, asylum seekers. There's all kinds of black folk. If you just care about black folk, you should care about this issue. Because they're catching hell right now. Not because they're black. The thing that subjects you to premature death in Palestine ain't being black, it's being Palestinian. And so we don't want to just bring in American racial logic here, but we can't ignore anti-blackness either. So I say all that to say, there are so many compelling reasons why we should care about what's going on in Palestine. But I want to bring y'all back to the first one, because for me, that's the most important. And in a room of believers, that has to be the most important. When all else fails, when all other arguments fall short, we must fight for Palestinian liberation because it is a righteous struggle. It is a principled struggle, and it is an inevitable struggle toward justice, but only if we do the work and fight and struggle with our brothers and sisters.
Thank you. So Pastor Moss, this was your and my first time in that Holy Land, and I wrote down some things you said during that sermon. So we already heard you say something along these lines, but you said, we must learn how to critique ourselves because the residue of empire still rests upon each of us. And I noted that you also said, but the power is when we are walking a spiritual road, we develop and we grow. So essentially, if we allow ourselves to grow, we're not the same person on the other side of that experience. So I would love for you to share with us, and I don't even, I haven't heard this, how bearing witness in that place, in that really, really special place, how did that change you? And what did you see or experience that caused you to grow?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. First, it was an incredible and amazing trip. We were not tourists, we were pilgrims. We were there to learn and to get reconnected with our community. And as already been stated, within the black imagination, the idea of Jerusalem has been a place of liberation, a space where people can live free. When you are an invisible, visible person in a country where your imagination is colonized and your body is occupied. And going to Jerusalem and going to Palestine, it assisted in decolonizing my own imagination. Because as people of African descent, no matter how many books you read and things of that nature, and as African-centered as you may be, as spiritually rooted as you have connected yourself, there is still in the corner of your imagination images that don't fit with reality. And then landing on the soil and having the imagination shift. Going to Jericho, and I'll just tell you, it's a joke. It really wasn't a joke. It actually happened. Rami and I are walking through the streets of Jerusalem. And of course, Rami meets somebody he knows that he met on Twitter 5 years ago. And we're walking, they're like, Rami! I was like, dude, do you know everybody? And so they have this conversation, and we make our way to the African Palestinian community house, and then we're going to get one of the best falafels in Jerusalem, right? I was hungry when I got off the plane. And the brother who was serving was raising the question, are you Egyptian? And I said, no, I'm from the other south side, and that is Chicago. And then when we are moving in and around Jerusalem, I'm going to the shops. Some of the shopkeepers assumed that I'm Palestinian. They didn't speak to me. Until I spoke, they realized I was from the United States. And the engagement was different. And then in another area, when we were in Jericho, some people just assumed that I was African Palestinian. And then I ran into some other folks. There were some Nigerians coming down the Mount of Olives. There's someone said, "You're not Nigerian, you Ethiopian?" I was like, "No, I'm from the South Side." I had to keep, but again, the imagination had been decolonized just by having the connectivity with the community. And being able to be in the space. Here we are, Christmas time. And as a person who follows this Palestinian Jew named Jesus, what is peculiar being in Bethlehem and a family that is a refugee, a migrant in an occupied territory dealing with the powers of Rome. But yet, a white imagination removes all of that context in reference to the story, where Jesus becomes a Swedish hippie. I don't know anybody who looks like that, the little Jesus like that. But it was the decolonization of the imagination and recognizing the residue of empire that we all carry. Being in America, having the residue of empire on you, and even when you are seeking to do that which is righteous, some of the dust of what you've been around falls on those you're engaging. So you always have to be about removing of the residue. And as you mentioned, the message for those who are nerds and around Star Wars, I gave it was a Star Wars reference, by the way, that when George Lucas created Star Wars, he was trying to figure out, how do I talk about the Vietnam War? And the empire was America. Darth Vader were American politicians. The Jedi Knights was Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. That's where he got the idea from. And the problem is that within this context, many of us think we're Jedi Knights, but we are really the empire. And until we recognize the empire that we carry, we cannot bury it permanently. And our connection with standing and building relationships with our Palestinian brothers and sisters is a part of decolonizing our own minds, is a part of removing empire residue, and is a part of building what I would call a band of democracy. And that's the beautiful thing, that I'm glad that, we Move Fresh and Ronnie were playing music, and they were facing the blues and lifting up Ray Charles and all of the beauty of this tradition. And I believe that liberation will come not from people who are politicians, but those who are poets, people who are artists, and people who are able to decolonize others' imagination. It says not the land, it's the imagination. When we decolonize the imagination, that is when liberation comes. And I believe that the jazz ethic within the African American tradition teaches this idea because the jazz ethic was teaching America and the world democracy before democracy even recognized that it could fall upon the spirits of those who were not shaped in a European image. That the music in itself allows people who are not supposed to play together, allows instruments that are not supposed to play together. The saxophone is for the marching band, and the piano is a European classical instrument, and the drum set shouldn't use African polyrhythms, and the bass is supposed to be played with a bow, not your fingers. But within the jazz tradition, you are allowed to play together, but also you are also given the right to solo out of your unique cultural tradition. In other words, if I'm Palestinian, I'm gonna break it down Palestinian in my solo. If I'm black, I'm gonna break it down as a black person with my solo. No matter where you are from, you come and play your particular solo, but we still have the same chord. In the words of John Coltrane, maybe we'll create a love supreme in the process.
So we got to hear this just on the bus, walking around. And if you'll imagine, right, that scene that you saw on the Mount of Olives talking about Star Wars, yes, and the residue of empire, it was just a moment that we'll never get back. But I think what happened when we were there was this feeling, this sense of urgency, like when we get home, we have to do something, right? Everything, you cannot go, if you go the way that we went, and not feel that sense of urgency to come back. And because we came back just before or on or right after October 7th, that sense of urgency just like ratcheted up. Like we were already feeling it, and then it was just escalated. And so Dima, for you, I'm thinking about all of these young folks who are finding their voice in this moment, who are waking up in the morning, opening Instagram, watching all of this unfold and saying, I cannot be silent. I need to do something. I'm thinking about the academics who are being threatened. Their jobs are being threatened. I'm thinking about everyday folks who just, put a flag up at their house or, speak out, post something on social media and get called into a manager's or supervisor's office. Your work supporting people speaking out for Palestinian freedom on the legal side of it, your work was already intense before, 2 months ago. Can you tell us what you're experiencing now? What kind of cases are coming to to you and your staff, and how are you keeping up with the influx?
If I describe too much, I think it'll have, the contrary impact here, right? But, there are so many people in this room who, we didn't start mobilizing on October 7th, right? Like, there has been a growing, incredible, beautiful movement that has really made incredible strides over the last couple decades. And of course it didn't, there has been a movement, for many years in the United States for Palestinian rights, but like the civil rights movement, like other liberation movements, it ebbs and flows, and the repression escalates, and movements ebb and flow. But over the last couple decades in particular, we've seen an incredible burgeoning of this movement, and it's partly because of the escalation in Palestine on the ground. What's been happening has been televised, right? For every attack on Gaza, again, it didn't begin on October 7th. Every attack on Gaza has left us with these immense emotions watching our people slaughtered. And that mobilizes us. And so certainly since October, that has been the case on, I think, an unprecedented level when we started seeing the scale of what is happening. And I go back to really, this is just a reflection of our power. This is a reflection of how threatening we are as a movement, that there is such fierce repression here. And again, when empire is threatened, they will come after us. That is inevitable. It has happened in every movement for justice throughout history. And I don't need to repeat it here, right? But the repression of the civil rights movement was incredible, and was a reaction to the power of the movement and the impact that it was having. The sit-ins, right? The marches, the incredible leaders and the Ella Bakers and the student activists right? Similar to various other movements, the anti-apartheid movement, the indigenous justice movement, the Chicano liberation movement, right? It's also fueled by youth. And so we're seeing incredible activism on campuses where young people are not afraid, they are unapologetic, and they are demanding better from their own universities, from our leaders, and from the older generations too, right, who have left us in this situation. And so today, I'll just say, in about 7 weeks, we've had 1,000 people coming to us for help. And this is compared to maybe 300 that we responded to all of last year, right? So just to give you a comparison. So the volume is immense about just coming to us, and this is like there are lawyers, every lawyer we talk to, oh, I'm getting calls here and there and the other. We've had about 100 people who have been reported being fired for their jobs, for saying something on social media, for responding to one of their employers' statements of, standing with Israel, what have you. And students in particular are facing the brunt of the repression. Student disciplinary hearings and various consequences for their activism on campuses. And yet, it hasn't stopped. It hasn't slowed down, and I think, on the contrary, it has grown. Our resolve has grown. The protests are continuing because we know the stakes. We know what the stakes are. And the other piece of this, I think, is that the more that we are connecting what's happening across struggles, the more power we have. And we have seen over the last 10 and 20 years, certainly as long as I've been working on this issue, that one of the biggest threats, and Israeli officials have said this, right? One of the biggest threats is that cross-movement solidarity. They have said our biggest problem is Black Lives Matter. Because Black Lives Matter has made the connections. They say, divest from military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex and invest in our communities, right? Invest in our schools and our healthcare system. And that is a threat. And they have said, divest from companies complicit in Israel's occupation and apartheid system. So, we've seen over the last several weeks just an incredible solidarity that is unwavering, even as students are doxxed, right? Their faces plastered on trucks. You're anti-Semites, you're pro-terrorist. That does not stop them. And they are unwavering. And, we have students here who have lost their jobs for saying something, for speaking out on social media or what have you. And their resolve is unwavering. So I think this is just a lesson for us all that, yes, there are risks. There are real risks to our livelihoods. We lost a 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was stabbed to death by his landlord just because he's Palestinian. We had 3 university students in Vermont who were shot because they were wearing keffiyehs and speaking Arabic. So the risks are real, and yet we don't have the luxury to stop. Not just until there's a ceasefire, but until there's freedom. And not just freedom for Palestinians. Yeah. We have a responsibility to fight not just for freedom for Palestinians, but freedom for us all, because as long as there are systems that hold down our people, that oppress our communities, that affects us all. And there's so much that we have to fight against. There are so many barriers to the solidarity, to building with each other that we have to overcome. And part of that is the racism that is ingrained in this, I think that's the residue of empire too, right? It is ingrained in this country. Anti-Black racism is ingrained in this country. It's part of the immigrant experience. And so we have to break those barriers, and that's the work that IMAN is doing on the ground in real time, right? But that's work that's also been happening across campuses in our communities, and that has to continue because, yeah, it's all connected.
Thank you. So we're getting those signals. Pastor Moss, really quickly, just, there's power in numbers and solidarity. You mentioned being in Bethlehem. It's Christmas season. We're seeing images, nativity scenes of baby Jesus in the rubble instead of the normal manger scene that we see. And we also know that you were responsible for helping organize 900 Black clergy in calling for a ceasefire. And that's right. And taking out a full-page ad in the New York Times to do that. Can you quickly tell us, what insight does that give us into what's happening in the Black church? And, where do we go from here? And then I'll go to you, Mark, after that.
Okay, really quickly, there is the Black church, and then there are churches that have Black people. I'm a part of the Black church tradition. I want it to be clear. And there was a group of people who were young and also elders that their hearts were breaking for the images, and they are committed to dignity, they are committed to peace, and taking out this full-page ad was a way of sharing a different narrative, the narrative of the Black church tradition. That's the tradition of King, that's the tradition of Septima Clark, that's the tradition of Fannie Lou Hamer, that's the tradition of Ida B. Wells, that's the tradition of Frederick Douglass, the Black church tradition, not a church that has Black people. Two very different. They have two different theologies. I could go into that on a completely different level. But it was was actually very powerful, where just so many people joined in immediately when the call was put out. And I want to give a shout out to Pastor Michael McBride in California, who was one of the principal organizers, along with a woman by the name of Dr. Barbara Skinner, one of our great elders, pulling in different people. And they were waiting for the moment because they said, what can we do? And it went viral from that moment. People giving $1, 50 cents. I think one lady gave a peppermint, butterscotch, and $10. I mean, she just said, I want this ad so that people will know that our hearts are breaking for our children.
That's right. All right, y'all. Mark, I'm gonna close this with you. You've written about this. You've also tested and pushed the limits of this Palestine exception. You know firsthand what some of those risks are. Where do you find the courage to keep going? And what, I'm looking at my sons back there. What do you tell them, right? What message do you have for all of us that we keep going?
Man, that's a heck of a question. That's a philosophical question as much as anything else, and an important one. I've taken some losses. The losses I've taken are nothing compared to what Palestinians have to endure every day. So at no moment do I feel bad about myself. Me losing a TV job is nothing compared to people who don't have access to running water or electricity, who are denied their homeland, who are wearing keys around their neck for the hope that one day they could return home or to the home of their grandmothers or great-grandmothers. So don't worry about me. I'll be okay. But it is important for us to recognize that there are those 1,000 people you talking about that are calling. They're calling because we live in a world where we are still punished for telling the truth. The most profound thing to me when I got fired from CNN 5 years ago, last month, was not that I got fired. I sort of go on. If you go on corporate media, you expect every day you're gonna get fired. If you're telling the truth, right? I mean, you know what I mean? I ain't had no 401k. I ain't none of that. At some point this week, I'm going to get fired because they're going to ask me something and I'm going to tell the truth, right? So you accept that. Most people don't. Most pastors don't. Most lawyers don't. Most teachers. It's not peculiar to our professions. It's just that most people would rather stay comfortable. And so what was strange to me was when I got fired was how many people, and I was saying this earlier today, whispered, yo, you were right. I'm so sorry that happened. I mean, even in a text message, they was whispering. It's like, and the most fascinating thing about it all for me, from the CNN perspective, they all got fired anyway. No, I'm not saying that to be shady, but they all got fired. Where they at? All right? At some point, they are coming for all of us. And the they that I'm talking about is our open enemies. It is people who don't want justice. It's people who don't want democracy. It's people who don't want solidarity. It's people who don't want radical love to prevail. They don't want us in this room right now figuring out how to get victory, because victory is justice for everybody. They don't want that. And so for me, the courage comes in a certain way from a pragmatism that says, this is dangerous. This is difficult. This is painful. But it's the only possible way that we can be victorious. And we are the children. That's the last thing I'm going to say. I'm going to take my seat in a minute.
Yes.
We are the children of people who had to do so much more with so much less. Think about your grandparents and your great-grandparents during the Nakba who left their villages, over 700,000 of them, and had to make a new life, a new home, a new reality, but never forgetting home. And they created something for you. Think about our ancestors, our grandmothers and great-grandmothers that were washing other people's clothes, cleaning other people's houses. Think about the people who gave their lives for a world that they would never even see. So they'd be proud to see Palestinian great-grandchildren and their black great-grandchildren in Ferguson teaching each other how to wash tear gas out of our eyes, teaching each other how to move against the wind, teaching each other to stand near this police officer because that way they won't tear gas you as fast, sharing tactical strategies of how we can protect our bodies but also shield our spirits from cynicism, from pessimism, from greed. And instead, imagine something different, imagine something better, having a more ambitious freedom dream than they could have ever imagined, but that they birthed for us. And that is one where we are all free. To me, that's what gives me the courage, is that I ain't got no other choice. We either gonna do this way, or we're gonna do it the other way. So let's do it. Let's fight, let's struggle, let's be victorious.
Thank you. Thank you. Dima, Marc, Pastor Moss, Rami, Iman, thank you so much.